All right, well, welcome back. Today, it's going to take you through another outline here on a couple different items. The first part is going to be the precursor or the beginning of the American Revolution. We'll go through some British policy in the French and Indian War. We'll finish up with the road to that revolution, which encompasses two key documents, Thomas Paine's Common Sense and eventually Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And then we'll culminate that with the end of the American Revolution as the colonists win and become a united American state. So here we go. The American Revolution, we look at the causes. We can go all the way back to some vocab that you should know by this time, and that is salutary neglect. Great Britain's policy in the early 1700s of not interfering in those American colonies as long as it served British interests. What does that mean? All Britain was trying to do was make as much money as possible. Now, there will be no more neglect, if you're following my cursor here. There will be no more neglect after the French and Indian War. War was very costly for Britain. They needed to recoup some of that money, and they're going to impose a boatload of taxes on the colonial people after the French and Indian War. If you're following along with maybe a timeline here, we're looking at after the year of 1763. All right. Colonial people were able to experience a lot of independence. They practiced self-government. They worship how they wanted, as long as Britain followed that policy of what? Salutary neglect. So after the French and Indian War, they're going to change that policy, and therefore they're really going to clamp down on what the colonial people do. So kind of like the joke here. You got the king here with the black glasses on like you can't see. He's not paying attention to the colonial people as long as he is making money, right? So you got that. As we move on, there's something known as the Albany Plan of Union proposed by Benjamin Franklin in 1754. All right. Before that revolution, the colonists actually saw themselves as part of the British Empire. We call that British subjects. They were subjective to the king's rule. They were also members of their own individual colonies and had some latitude to practice their self-governments and worship how they wanted. All right. In 1754, in Albany, Ben Franklin he attempted to get all the colonies together as protection against the French. That didn't happen. The colonial people shut that down. They did not want to act as one. They were acting as individual colonies at that time. You may find that change by the year 1776. Okay, so this thing was called the Albany Plan of Union. It was modeled after the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, if you know anything about the Iroquois, there were 6 Native American smaller tribes who banded together as one large Native American confederacy. A bunch of different Native American groups working together. Once again, the colonial people rejected that Albany Plan of Union. They felt that they were going to give up power to the whole. So it doesn't fly in 1754. You may find that work for colonial people in 1776. All right. Famous kind of little cartoon here by Ben Franklin. You have all the different colonies, which are parts of the snake, and he's basically saying to them, if we don't come together, we are going to die. We're not going to make it. So famous, if you ever see that, that's in regards to the Albany Plan of Union, which failed in 1754. All right. Moving on to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Once again, this kind of ends the French and Indian War. And at this point, 1763, you're going to find that Britain and the colonial people, their friendship, their relationship begins to go south. This is kind of the beginning of the American Revolution. So Great Britain actually beat France in, if you were in Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. Here in America, we learned that as the French and Indian War because we're looking at that through the colonial eyeball. We're looking at it from kind of our viewpoint. All right. With the French eliminated, the colonists felt free to move west, and they began to do so. They fought for the land. They want the land. They saw less of a need for British protection simply because we were growing as a nation, and there kind of was a loss of respect for the British soldiers during the French and Indian War. All right. The British government responds and issues something known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. Basically, draws a line on the map. It follows the Appalachian Mountains and basically tells these colonial people you cannot go west of that line. I'll show you a map in a minute so you see it. Why did the king do this? Well, this happened after an event called Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac was an Ottawa chieftain. He fought against the British settlements, which kept moving westward toward encroaching on other Native American lands. So the king says, okay, for Pontiac, I don't want to pay for any more protection for these colonial people. So it's real simple. I'm going to draw a line. Don't go beyond that line. We don't have any problems, right? So if you want to see it, this is kind of the map at the beginning of the French and Indian War. You have the British colonies. You have the French settlements, which are all the way down to St. Lawrence, in and throughout the Great Lakes, and then all the way down to Mississippi. Well, the French, I'm going to X them out right here, they lose. After the French and Indian War in 1763, you're looking at Britain gained all of this land all the way up to the Mississippi River. That's all British territory. Look over here. The colonial people, only had the land up to the Appalachian Mountains. Now we have the land all the way to the Mississippi River. Spain kind of gets the rest of this from France. They're working on that over in Europe. I'm not too concerned about that. But what you see here is the king draws this line, Proclamation Line, 1763, and basically tells these colonial people, do not go west of that line. Do not go beyond that line. And these colonial people, of course, they weren't going to listen to him. They started funneling through the Cumberland Gap, hitting the Ohio River, and settling in these areas, which were then maintained pretty much by Native Americans. So we got some problems, for sure. There are a ton of economic causes to the revolution. After the French and Indian War, Great Britain is broke. They had secure control over a very large portion of America, but the French and Indian War cost them a lot of money. They have a lot of war debt to pay to their citizens, and they borrow money. They need to pay it back. They need a way to generate money. So what do? They basically are going to create a lot of extra taxes so Britain could get that money to pay for the large military force that they're keeping in colonial America against the French, just in case there's another one. And of course, the king is going to tell the colonial people, hey, I'm going to tax you, but it's for your benefit. I'm taxing you to protect you. Well, that's not going to fly, all right? Britain believed the colonists should pay. So the British Parliament began to enforce a policy of mercantilism. You need to realize that this policy was already around, but once again, there's a period of salutary neglect. Now they're going to enforce it. All right. What is mercantilism to kind of give you? The mother country, Great Britain, is trying to get as much gold and silver as possible. How are they going to do that? They need what's called a favorable balance of trade. So they are going to export way more than they import. Very simply, they're going to be selling more than they're buying. Therefore, they're making money. How are they going to do that? You look over here. You just put England here if you wanted to, right? They're going to take from the colonies gold, silver, fur, lumber, foodstuffs, natural resources coming this way. They're going to take those natural resources and they're going to build things like a dresser, a bed, furniture, who knows what. They're going to build it. Then they're going to sell that stuff right back to the colonies. So taking raw materials, selling back manufactured goods, and if you follow my curve all the way over here, what's that going to do? It's going to get Britain what? More and more and more money. So that's what they're trying to do. All right. The policy, once again, is called mercantilism. So if you kind of go to the definition here, you'll see it. It is an economic system. Anytime you see economic, you're thinking money. During the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, where European countries tried to be strong by doing what? Accumulating as much money as possible. Accumulating precious metals. What precious metals specifically? Gold and silver. This is done by, the last slide I showed you, exporting, protecting their businesses, make sure people buy their stuff, and establishing colonies so they can sell them stuff. Where colonies supplying raw materials and markets. While restrictions were placed on colonial trade, those are called Navigation Acts. We'll get into that a little later. All right. What happened after the French and Indian War? which led to the American Revolution. So we're going to go through some bullets here. These are once again some economic causes of the Great Depression. Economic causes of the American Revolution. All right. 1764, the first kind of bullet. Parliament, which is the British Congress, they make laws. They passed the Sugar Act, which taxed imports on the colonial people, which made products more expensive. All right. There will be colonial reactions to these. They're going to boycott the goods. They're going to stop buying those particular products. They're going to beat up tax collectors. It gets real ugly. All right. In 1765, Parliament passes what is known as the Stamp Act, which is a specific tax on all printed materials. Now, the difference between the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act hurt mostly merchants and people who drank the tea and those sorts of things. So I mean, it wasn't truly impacting everyone. The Stamp Act, these colonial people hated because now the newspaper costs more money. Now, if you want to get married, the marriage deed costs more money. You want to buy a home, the deed to your home now costs more money because there's a specific tax on printed goods, and the colonists hated this. All right. There were a bunch of navigation acts, which were specific laws that told the colonists who they can trade with, who they couldn't trade with, what ships they had to use, what ports they had to go to, and any specific taxes around anything that was being traded. Realize these navigation acts were around since the 1600s, but they were not enforced until after the French and Indian War, which was an end to salutary neglect. So if you read through that, you'll see that. Now, Britain passed these acts clearly simply to raise money, but colonial actions forced their repeal. They boycotted, they tarred and feathered tax collectors. So a lot of these acts will get repealed, and then Britain will just create some new acts, which is, once again, moving us forward to the Townshend Acts. All right, these are taxes on any imported goods from England. Tea, lead, paper products, those sorts of things. So you got that, right? There are also some political causes to this revolution, all right? And here's what the king told them, which is kind of a farce, but we'll go through it. The king's like, listen, the money that is generated from all of these taxes, they're going to be used to pay the colonial officials. We're taxing you, but we're using the money for you. Well, the colonial legislatures saw this as a political threat, based on the idea that the legislatures before this could withhold the English officials' salaries. So if the king appointed a governor, and in Boston they didn't like the governor, they didn't pay him. Well, now if the king's governor is there, he's going to do whatever the king wants, and the king is going to pay him with money that they gathered from these acts, from these taxes, from the colonists. So once again, what did the colonial people do? They were mad, right? They petitioned. They said, we don't like it. They boycotted British goods. They said, we're not going to buy that stuff, right? And there was other more violent protests, and this is an example of a tar and feather. What the colonial people do to the British taxman is they would strip him in the nude. They would pour boiling hot tar all over his body, which would scald the skin and then, obviously stick to him for a while. And then they dump a bucket of feathers on him and make him look like a big chicken. Right? I know it's kind of loosely stated, but imagine putting boiling tar on your skin, and this wasn't so nice. And in this particular rendition of the tar and feather, they're taking boiling tea and pouring it down the guy's throat, scalding his throat, burning his throat. So when we say, those protests were violent, you kind of get the feeling for that. So hopefully you understand that. Moving on to some other political causes, right? In Virginia, obviously Virginia was the most populous colony. The House of Burgess Representative Patrick Henry wrote out some resolutions to oppose the Stamp Act. They didn't like it, all right? In Boston, it was a little more fervent. They were a little more crazy in Boston. Sam Adams, yes, the beard guy, he organized the Sons of Liberty and the Massachusetts Committee of Correspondence. So these people were communicating with each other, and the Sons of Liberty were brutal. Those are your guys tar and feathering. They're burning down tax collectors' houses. They're threatening their lives. They were brutal. All right, so they were kind of terrorizing the British tax collectors. The colonists claimed that Britain was violating their natural rights because they had no representation in Parliament. This is a key feature here. So the colonists weren't unwilling to pay taxes. They were willing to pay taxes if they had a say in what was being taxed. And at this particular juncture, the laws were being made over in Britain, in Parliament, and the colonists did not have a representative. There was a belief amongst the colonists that the only taxes to be paid should come from themselves. We will determine what taxes we want to pay. Parliament obviously resented these thoughts. There's a break in the action here. The two sides are not getting along. You can see that. Moving on to some social and ideological causes. All right. What else is happening which made this break possible, which kind of contributed to the American Revolution? And, quickly 3 bullets here, you can see them. We were separated by 3,000 miles of ocean. The king is 3,000 miles away, creating policy across the Atlantic Ocean. And really, I mean, when the cat's away, the mice play, right? So there was a sense of self-sufficiency. There's already a sense of independence amongst the colonial people because, the king was just so far away. Colonists believed that they had natural rights. They got this from the Enlightenment. And there was an event, kind of a religious event known as the Great Awakening, where people began questioning the church, questioning authority. Hey, let's think for ourselves as to what should be right and wrong. Well, the king's not going to like that because what is that? They are going to question his authority. And if you question the king's authority in England, they just killed you. But he can't deal with that when it's 3,000 miles away. It's a little tougher to curtail that, all right? So what do we have here? 2 documents that you got to know that we'll get into. What led up to the American Revolution, and eventually a document that Thomas Jefferson wrote, the Declaration of Independence. So as we continue to move along here, skip it, here you go. Resistance leads to crisis and war. There's some political resistance here. So what are the sayings? 1773, Parliament passes one of the last laws that really get the colonists going, and that's the Tea Act. It was a specific tax on British tea because one of their companies, the East India Tea Company, was failing. They weren't making money. So Parliament decided to tax this so that company can make more money and they could save them from failure. Well, that really pissed the colonists off. All right. Well, they protested with what? We cannot be taxed unless we have some representatives in Parliament. Same idea as before, right? What did they do? Famous night. The colonists dressed as Native Americans. They destroyed 3 shiploads of British tea. It was known as the Boston Tea Party. You may have seen this event. It was the biggest tea party in history. And the problem with that was these colonial rebels, Sam Adams and the boys of Boston, this happened in Boston Harbor, they destroyed over what would be in today's dollars, over $1 million worth of tea. Now, if you're the king, you're not going to be happy with that. You got to do something, don't you? Well, what does he come back with? King George III, the British Crown, reacts with what is known as the Intolerable Acts. You destroy $1 million worth of king's tea, he's going to say what? Cannot tolerate that behavior. So in 1774, notice we're getting real close to 1776, boom, lays down the hammer on him, all right? What did he do? Closed Boston Harbor down. He said, I will open the harbor back up when you pay that $1 million that you just ruined. Well, that wasn't going to happen. He forbidden town meetings. He didn't want these people getting together, discussing issues, discussing the king, and formulating plans. He reduced the power of their legislatures to the point where they, number one, they couldn't meet, so they couldn't accomplish anything. And he sent the boys. He's going to send British troops to Boston to keep an eye on these rebels. And obviously, when you're living in a city and you're surrounded by a military that is really not in favor of what you're doing, you can see some problems arise, right? We tried to get together. There was colonial efforts at Union. So when you look at that Union, think about it. We had 13 independent colonies. Now we're looking at the United States of America. Eventually, they get together, all right? They meet. After the Albany Plan of Union, which was in 1754, Ben Franklin, the snake cartoon, they meet at a place called the First Continental Congress in Philly. 12 of the colonies sent representatives. Rhode Island was absent to Philly to discuss the British actions. What's Britain doing? By the time they meet again, there was 2 little battles, one at Lexington, one at Concord. And they met again to discuss, hey, what are we going to do here? Should we stick with the king? Should we keep fighting? What do you want to do? See, what happened at Lexington and Concord is in Concord we had a store of weapons. So the British knew that things were getting a little crazy, and they were going to go to our warehouse and take all of our weapons. And we met them on the grassy knoll there, and we started going at it. So these would be known in history as maybe the shot heard around the world. These are the first battles of the American Revolution. Realize, even after those battles, these colonies were divided. Should we fight? Should we make nice with the king? Should we fight? Should we make nice? So the two groups you want to know are Tories or Loyalists. The other group is the Patriots. So these are the same people here. All right. Tories or Loyalists, they supported the king. They wanted reconciliation. They wanted to say, we're sorry, and we'll stick with you. So these guys were against the revolution. Patriots, on the other hand, they want out. We don't want that king. We are leaving. We want independence, and we're willing to continue to fight. So your Patriots are in support of what happened at Lexington and Concord. Your Loyalists are like, listen, we don't really want to fight the king because he's got a big army, and we can get in a little trouble. All right. So what happened here? Two documents you absolutely, positively must know. All right. First one is written. They're both written in 1776, by the way. Thomas Paine writes a little pamphlet. It is so simple. It is called Common Sense. He titles it Common Sense because what he's writing, he's like, everyone should just believe this. It's so simple. You could say it. Yeah, it's common sense, right? What did he do? He persuaded Loyalists to become Patriots. So now you should know those terms by now, right? So he convinced people who wanted to stay with the king to want to leave the king. And here's how he did it. I'll give it to you. Common sense in a nutshell. He basically writes down in his little pamphlet, listen, folks, the king is 3,000 miles away. We don't need him. We have everything we need right here in America. We have trees, we have lumber, we have coal, we have natural cordage. We can build our own ships. We can trade our own. He just writes all this down and he's like, here, we don't need Britain. They need us. So by promoting that argument, once again, what was so important about that? He convinced people who wanted to stay with the king to want to leave the king. And what did we end up declaring? Our independence. So because of that pamphlet, so many more people become patriots that Thomas Jefferson signs it, basically exclusively wrote the document, but a bunch of people signed the document. It is called the Declaration of Independence. And in that document, we draw from the ideas from the Enlightenment and the ideas of John Locke. And July 4th, 1776, and July 5th, everyone signs it, and we move forward. We actually declare our independence. So let's take a quick look at the Declaration as a document. These are things that you may be tested on, so you have to know what Thomas Jefferson actually wrote. All right? So we're going to go through the three different stages here. All right? Number one, what is the first part of our declaration? There's a purpose. Why are we writing it? It was kind of a letter to the king, but it was also a letter to the world. Hey, world, we are a new country. We're independent. We are no longer with the king. We're in the middle of fighting the king. So if you want to help us, we'll take that help. And also, we're willing to trade with anybody. We're open for business. The second thing that we did was we had to explain and justify why we were doing that. If not, we look like a little brat. So there's a list of things in the Declaration that say, here's all the crap the king did to us. Here's why we had to become independent. All right. So when you look at the three parts, first part's pretty simple. We wrote down what kind of government we would like. At that point, we didn't have a government because we were leaving the king. So we wrote down a theory of government. Don't get confused. We didn't create a government. We wrote down what kind of government we might like. We also, in the middle of the document's phenomenal. There's a whole list of things. He won't let us trade with anyone else. He shut down our port of Boston. He won't let us, go to any other port or hang out with the Spanish. He. What are they talking about? Here's all the things that the king did to us that made us declare. What are we doing? Justifying why we had to declare our independence. And finally, in the end, we say, hey, we're independent. You want to trade with us? You want to help us beat Britain? Whatever. We're open for business, right? So there's a couple key ideas about government. This is going up here to that theory. What does it really say? Living under the king, people didn't have natural rights. He killed you whenever he wanted. He put you in prison, whatever. Well, what did we believe in? People have natural rights. And we got this from John Locke. What are they? You have a right to live, you have the right to certain freedoms, and you should be able to do whatever you want to do within reason. Sounds simple enough. At that point, it was revolutionary, right? The other two parts are kind of talking about why we did what we did with the king, okay? When a governments receive their power to govern from the consent of the governed. Kids screw that up all the time, so let's talk about it. What he's saying is the only reason the government has power is because the people give it that power, the consent of the governed. We give the government power to do what it does. Okay, so the government has power. We understand that. Then they're saying, well, wait a second. What are they doing with that power? That power, let me cursor back here, is for the fundamental purpose of protecting my stuff, protecting my rights. I give the government power. The government protects my stuff. And we follows that up, Jefferson. Beautiful statement. If that government doesn't protect my stuff, I have the right, it is the right of the people, to either change that government or abolish that government. Now, abolish means if you get rid of something, then you got to create a whole new one. So we'll see that in play as we win the American Revolution, and these colonial people end up building some governments, right? So the ideas of the Declaration of Independence, what do we have? What do we say about the government? What are those things? Well, number one, the government should have limits. The government can't just do whatever it wants to. And we actually wrote those things down. Those are in our Constitution and something known as the Bill of Rights. Why is the Declaration, why is this revolution so awesome? It's pretty simple. I mean, what we did in 1776, the French did in the late 1700s. South American independence movements began in the early 1800s. These movements have been going on in the 20th century over in Africa and Asia, right? You don't have to live under a dictator. You don't have to live under a king. People should have some stuff. We need our rights, right? But we got one problem, and we can't ignore it. There's still a fundamental contradiction between the Declaration of Independence, between our Constitution and the ideals of freedom and liberty, because they weren't applied to all people. They weren't applied to women. They certainly weren't applied to slaves. So, although we believed in these things, we didn't necessarily give them to everyone. And that's a fault of our framers, the founding fathers. I like to think over time that we do make that better, and we're not in that position anymore. So I like to think that we're progressive as a country, and we're going to get better. Okay. So moving on, we're going to fight a war for independence. It's going to be a few years here, and you'll see some things happening. Here's what you should focus on. During the war, the colonists created a government that was really bad. And I'll deal with that in the next section of videos for you. In 1781, we created the Articles of Confederation. It was terrible. We'll find out what it did do. We'll find out what it did do. But when you look at a war, you want to kind of compare the two sides. So take a peek here. We built an army. The British already had an army. We built an army. Well, what are our strengths? We had guys like Washington, and we had some help from the French. And I'm telling you, we made smarter decisions on the battlefield. Number one, because, second bullet, we were fighting on home territory. We knew where to hide. We knew where the food was. The Britain had to beat us, so they had to come over here. And we got some help from the French, and we also got the help from some of our Native American allies, right? What are the British strengths? They have a well-trained army. They have a navy. They got a ton of money. Obviously, because they were taxing us. So they got enough resources. We were ill-equipped, right? And they had some help from the Loyalists, mostly down south and in places like New York City. But the Loyalists stuck with the king. Patriots wanted to fight the king's army. There are some weaknesses for the American army or the Continental Army, right? We're small, untrained military. We're not a military. We're a bunch of farmers got together to beat up on the king. I mean, come on. They wanted independence. They're all willing to fight for it. So a lot of people gave their lives for that, right? We did not have a lot of resources. Until the French aided us, we did not have a lot of resources. And we built a government that really didn't have any power, and we didn't really know what we were doing. All we know is we wanted independence. When you look at the British weaknesses, pretty simple. It's very tough to fight a war that far from home. And when the British sent their troops over, they don't know where to go. whereas we know all the little nooks and crannies and the mountains, and we know where to hide, we know where the food is. They don't. So that's strengths and weaknesses for you. All right. What happens? George Washington, as you should know, is our colonial commander-in-chief. He becomes our first president. He's a big leader, great presence. He's good. Benjamin Franklin, he's the one who negotiated the French help. All right, he negotiated an alliance with France after the Battle of Saratoga. This is the TP for me, the turning point of the American Revolution, Saratoga. After Saratoga, we get French help. We're on the move, right? We know we're going to win, though. We got a good shot at it. What did France do for us? Well, they gave us military arms, weapons. They sent over troops. They got a navy so that we were able to use their navy instead of in the midst of building our own. And they kept Britain pretty busy on the high seas so they couldn't keep bringing more and more and more troops over, right? Britain did surrender at the Battle of Yorktown, and the Treaty of Paris was signed 1783. I always go back to this. Don't get confused. There's a Treaty of Paris in 1763 that ended the French and Indian War. There's a Treaty of Paris 1783, ends the American Revolution, and there's another Treaty of Paris coming up, 1898, which ends the Spanish-American War. So what does it say? Number one, Great Britain had to come out, sign the treaty, and announce to the world that the United States was independent. We have our own country. We are no longer colonies. We don't have to do what the king tells us to do. Second thing it did is set the boundaries with Canada to the north and Spanish and Florida to the south. The big one is the Mississippi River. So the American country, when it began, our border went from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific River. What's nice about that is we kind of made a deal with the Spanish where we were both allowed to use the river and we didn't want any problems. All right. So here's our land all the way up to the Mississippi River. Notice there's no Britain here. This is the United States. When? Treaty of Paris, 1783. Britain could stay up over in northern Canada with the French people. And this is kind of, if you go back, this is what the map looked like after the Treaty of Paris, 1763. That would be after the French and Indian War. So you got two different treaties here, 20 years apart. Notice Great Britain, notice United States. So the map is changing, right? The map is changing. The last little bit is, what happened to all the other people, right? So let's look at slavery, African Americans, and the outcome, the end of the American Revolution, right? So African Americans, they fought on both sides. Some helped the British, some stayed with the American colonists, which would end up being the United States. If you're a slave, why would you fight with the British? There's a promise of freedom. They say, you fight with us, we'll guarantee your freedom. So, I mean, if you could get away or you were rescued by some British troops, you join. You promise your freedom. Some slaves, in the turmoil of the fighting, just left. They escaped, right? Others were freed in return for their military service, right? Some of them even left the country. When Britain lost and they left, a lot of slaves left with them, right? Some actually moved out to the northern cities. Now, why is that a big thing? Well, you should remember the majority of slaves were down in southern colonies, plantations. So that begins to change the population up in the northern states. Well, the anti-slavery movement, which you should know is led by the Quakers, actually began in Pennsylvania with the Quakers, who were passive and thought slavery is wrong. We're going to pass a bunch of laws up in the northern states to either get rid of it or gradually get rid of it because it's wrong. So the northern states were pretty progressive in getting rid of slavery. Now, just because people aren't slaves doesn't mean, let me go back here, just because they're not slaves doesn't mean that everything's cool. Think about it. Color, relations in this country. Those people might have been free, but they weren't treated nice. Got to know that. Right? They still face discrimination. They were not allowed to vote. There were definitely segregated places, certainly in public and housing and transportation. So those kinds of things persist up in the northern colonies. But what's the good thing? The northern colonies began to get rid of slavery. So we'll see that movement continue up into the Civil War. All right. Some effects of that revolution. Obviously, we got our own country. That's the biggest one. But states drafted new constitutions, emphasizing what? The government shouldn't have as much power. So some limits. Great Britain did recognize our country as being independent. We got our own nation. We're looking good. The Iroquois League, sorry to say, although they stayed with us, they were destroyed. And the Native Americans were pushed farther west. Why? As we began to band together and get stronger, it was easier to take more and more land from those natives and push them further westward. Kind of a sad part in American history, right? The ideas of freedom and natural rights inspired some people to begin opposing slavery, especially where? Northern states. With who? Began with Quakers, people who are really religious. Why? The golden rule, right? Do unto others as you want done to you. Some people began to re-examine traditional ideas about women's roles. Going to be progressive. It's going to take some time for people who are willing to really let women get the right to vote and those sorts of things. And the last thing, the ideas of the revolution influence other events in other parts of the world. Now, to take this home here, what do you really want to remember? You better know Thomas Paine's Common Sense. You better know what is in the Declaration of Independence. So if you need to go back and look at that, I would. After the revolution, the next couple of videos, we'll definitely be talking about the creation of a national government and its weaknesses, its strengths, and how that government prevails. So look forward to having you guys learn some stuff, and we'll keep this going.